In our last video on the subject, we talked in detail about Babeuf and the conspiracy of the equals within the directory of the First French Revolution. We also talked about some of the other individuals whom were involved in the coup plot at the time, such as Italian revolutionary Buonarroti and French poet Miracle. These men, along with their contemporaries, were critics of every aspect of society and its institutions, from law to politics to economics, to the family, to religion, to various social norms, etc. They were believers in a kind of society free of exploitation, where the means of production were held in common and goods were distributed according to need. And thus, the first people to refer to themselves as socialists had emerged from the revolutionary era of France from 1789 to 1795. Whom demanded not just equal political rights, but equal economic rights as well. These men, who wanted to bring an end to class distinctions altogether, were referred to by Marx and Engels as Utopian socialists, since their revolutionary groundwork was left wanting, and the means by which they wanted to achieve socialism involved talking the rich into giving up their wealth, or reformism, or even outright abandoning civilization to form communes out in the countryside. The old French revolutionaries did not think in terms of class conflict, and they didn't know the difference between a socialist revolution and a bourgeois democratic revolution, such as the one that France was going through at the time. The old utopians did not see themselves as representatives of the proletariat, for the working class had yet to be completely established as the main subjugated class within the new social order. Like all great thinkers, they were limited to their time and their individual context. To them, socialism was not only an ideal worth striving towards and a moral philosophy, but a means of escape from the rapidly changing world that was snuffing out the old feudal order from existence. Throughout the 1700s and into the mid-1800s, the class vestiges of mercantilism and feudalism were crushed into the dirt. The construction of the first cities and the rise of the capitalist class and landlords was squeezing the petty proprietors out from existence. That is, the small business owner, the self-employed worker, the journeyman, the blacksmith. The decentral production was being replaced by large-scale, centralized industrial production and economics of scale. And thus, the first socialists had no grasp of historical materialism. They did not understand that industrialization and economics of scale had emerged organically. And rather than try to overthrow the new order, many sought to escape it. They sought the freedom of property within the context of feudalism, as well as the freedom from property within the context of capitalism as well. The first socialism was therefore a kind of petty bourgeois socialism centered around small-scale self-ownership, fair trade between equal entities, and the agrarian peasant commune. It is in this way that the first socialists arose largely as a reaction to the emergence of capitalist economic relations and the big bourgeoisie. For the victory of the Third Estate during the French Revolution was really a victory for the wealthy propertied interests within the directory fighting for legal equality as to unshackle themselves from the baggage of the feudal order. That is, the right of royal bloodlines to rule, since within the context of feudalism, legal equality did not exist between entities, so it was hypothetically possible for a merchant to be 10 to 20 times wealthier than the lord of the land and still be beneath the noble legally. As a result, with the end of the old feudal legal structures, the pathway was carved for the first capitalist class to emerge. And it was these early capitalists and landlords who mostly prospered and profited from the revolution, while the general public still largely remained poor. And in light of this, we saw the rise of figures such as Gracchus Babeuf, Sylvain Miracle, and Philippe Buonarroti. And at the same time, we saw the emergence of other utopian thinkers, such as Saint-Simon, Francois Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen as well. Saint-Simon was a young man in his mid-20s during the storming of the Bastille, and he witnessed firsthand the opportunism that had emerged during the victory of the Third Estate of the realm. Simon drew a line in the sand between the workers and the idlers, or the people who worked, produced things, and actually contributed to society on one hand, and those who simply lived off passive income or rents without giving anything back. Saint-Simon was also a determinist, believing that the natural world was governed by laws transcending the power of man, and that only by understanding these laws through the scientific method could history progress forward. Simone participated in America's war for independence and was a committed revolutionary through and through. He had hoped that through his writings and argumentative essays that he could take the world by storm and reason with the new ruling class and oppressed masses into seeing things as he did. That is, in a society based on the common ownership free of exploitation. Tragically, the world did not see eye to eye with him, and his many writings would fall on deaf ears. And in an act of despair and sadness at the world's unwillingness to listen and reason, in 1823 he attempted suicide by a gunshot to the head. By some miracle, however, after shooting himself in the head 6 times, he would survive and live on for another 2 years until 1825. Cause of death, unknown. And then there's Fourier, another great socialist thinker and social critic of the time, and a fervent advocate of women's rights. He often commented and criticized the social standing of women in present-day society, and once famously stated that the general degree to which a society was just, fair, and progressive was correlated with how much freedom and equality that women were treated with, and that the less patriarchal a society, the more emancipative and civilized, and vice versa. Fourier, like Buonarroti before him, was a believer in the notion that society progressed in stages, starting from savagery, and then on to barbarism, and then next up to patriarchy, and then finally, civilization. Fourier, like Hegel, was a fan of the dialectic method, but was also a hardline materialist. In other words, he was a user of dialectical materialism before its very solidification as a philosophy by Marx and Engels, and used this method to conclude that to truly achieve liberty, fraternity, and equality, that we would need a socioeconomic model based on cooperative labor prioritizing material abundance and distribution according to need. Like Simone before him, he too tried desperately to lobby his ideas to the world and convince the public of the validity of socialism, tragically to no avail. He would go on to pass in 1837 at age 65. And lastly, there was Robert Owen. Owen was a Welsh industrialist, reformist, and a member of the bourgeoisie himself. He was a very successful capitalist at the time, running a factory employing hundreds of workers below him in Manchester. From 1800 to 1829, New Lanark, a town in Scotland where one of the cotton mills was stationed, would become a testing ground for Owen's Utopian society. And in 1816, he wrote a book titled New View of Society, where he argued the case for a new economic mode and a change in the social relations. Owen sought to create a model society outside of the context of capitalism to show the world a new way is possible. And for some time, within New Lanark, there was a great success. Living standards rose, police, prisons, poverty, and alcoholism had practically vanished, and the Owenites would go on to build schools for the children of the town that would greatly be enjoyed. While average workdays in Scottish factories were some 13 to 14 hours a day at the time, workers in Owensville enjoyed a nice short 10-hour workday, wages were greater, and capitalist alienation was practically non-existent, and when crisis struck the cotton industry for 4 months, he had the capital reserves necessary to pay his workers for the entirety of their unemployment until the economy had recovered. Sounds like a true utopia, no? Well, this wasn't good enough for Owen, as he even wrote at one point, quote, "The people were slaves at my mercy." Owen sought to expand his utopia and wanted to build more communes in the likeness across Ireland, and with the capital inflows from his business he would be able to do it. When he came out to the public with his communization strategy, he was met with 3 ideological barriers from the outside world: private property, religion, and marriage. Owen proceeded to criticize and do polemics against these institutions despite knowing the consequences, and as a result, he was ostracized by his fellow countrymen and banished from Wales. Each one of these men had isms of their own, in reflection of their own ideas, from Saint Simonianism to Owenism and Fourierism, as well as self-proclaimed subscribers of each of these men's thought. But where are the Owenites today? What of the Fourierists and the Simonians? Or how about the Ricardians, the Proudhonites, the Lassallians, the Jacobins, the Babuvians, the Bernsteinians, the Kautskyites, the Narodniks, the Isarians? Why does no socialist alive today identify with these tendencies? The reason being is because they are dead ideologies belonging to dead men who were products of their individual time and circumstances, limited by their idealism and their moralism. And while they did make contributions to socialist thought and were indeed progressive thinkers, and have even influenced the likes of Marx and Engels. The reason why nobody identifies with them today is because they never synthesized a truly scientific political theory that was able to explain economic phenomenon within the current social order, and provide the philosophical and intellectual groundwork needed to transition from a capitalist society based on private ownership, market anarchy, and generalized commodity production, to a communist society based on social ownership, rational economic planning, and distribution according to need. To the utopians, socialism was either a petty bourgeois reaction to the rise of capitalism and the fall of feudalism, or it was an ideal that the ruling class could somehow be convinced into accepting and consenting to transition to, or it was something that could be achieved strictly through complete legal methods via reformism. The common thread between utopian trends was their belief that one could simply convince the ruling class to give up their wealth willingly, or that one could escape the capitalist system rather than overthrow it. They didn't understand the necessity of class struggle or the historic role of revolution, and oftentimes believed that the state could be abolished outright, that workers could be given the full proceeds of their labor tax-free, or that one could collaborate with the ruling class towards desired goals. A lot of bad ideas that still permeate to this day and are just as wrong now as they were 200 years ago. And meanwhile, Marxism, on the other hand, has stood the test of time. It is a model of political theory that is not only able to explain a variety of political economic phenomenon, but it also holds predictive power as well and has been vindicated by the history. As Marx has predicted, crises within capitalism are an inevitable component built into it, not a glitch but a feature, and in addition, inequality would only grow worse and worse over time. The crises would grow in scale and intensity, and the contradictions inherent to the system would eventually lead to class struggle and proletarian revolution. In fact, Marxism has such potent predictive power and explains a variety of societal phenomena so well that an entire branch of science was born from the works of Marx and Engels, known as sociology, or the study of societal human behavior and its influences. In the end, in the same manner that other species of human have faded into extinction, and it is us, the Homo sapiens, that are all that remain, the utopian trends have come and faded into irrelevance, and now we Marxists are just about all that remains. For Marxism itself is a scientific critique of capitalist political economy, as well as a political theory behind the emancipation of the proletariat. It doesn't make any absolute claims as to how the transition will look, since each country will have its own unique material conditions that require addressing, but it is adaptable enough to where it can be amended and applied anywhere. And thus, dozens of Marxists have come along and superseded Marx and Engels, making advancements and contributions of their own, adapting and updating the science as capitalism as a system adapts and changes. And when one looks at the last 2 centuries of our history, it has been the Marxists who have been behind virtually every successful socialist movement.